In the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, history was about to turn. The year was 1944. The world was deep in the throes of the Second World War. For nearly 3 years, the United States and the Empire of Japan had been locked in a brutal struggle for control of this immense theater of war. The conflict had been a long and bloody affair, fought island by island, ship by ship. But in the summer of that year, a single massive naval battle would take place that would change everything. It was a confrontation that would decide the fate of nations and set the course for the final, violent chapter of the war. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The stakes could not have been higher. For the Americans, victory would mean securing a vital strategic position, a series of islands from which their new long-range bombers could finally reach the Japanese homeland. It would be a devastating blow to Japan's ability to wage war, and a clear sign that the end was drawing near. For the Japanese, this battle was a desperate gamble. They called their plan Operation Ago. It was an all-or-nothing attempt to destroy the American Pacific Fleet and halt its relentless advance across the ocean. A Japanese victory could have prolonged the war, giving them time to regroup and fortify their defenses, making the final American push unimaginably costly. The battle would be fought not just with ships and guns but with aircraft. It was a clash of carrier fleets, the new queens of naval warfare. Hundreds of planes would take to the skies, piloted by young men who knew that their actions would shape the future. The battle would be a test of technology, of training, of strategy, and of will. It was here in the waters west of the Mariana Islands that the industrial might of the United States would collide with the fading naval power of Japan. The outcome was far from certain in the minds of those who fought, but history would record it as one of the most decisive engagements of the entire war. This clash would become known by another, more informal name, a name given to it by the American pilots who participated. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name spoke to the lopsided nature of the aerial combat, a grim testament to the overwhelming superiority the Americans had achieved in the air. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than just a naval victory. It was the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm was effectively destroyed, a wound from which it would never recover. It was the beginning of the end for the Empire of Japan, a critical turning point on the long road to victory in the Pacific. By the middle of 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had clearly turned against Japan. The early years of the conflict following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had seen a string of stunning Japanese victories. They had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, creating a vast empire. But the Battle of Midway in 1942 had been a devastating blow. Japan lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. From that point on, the Japanese were on the defensive, fighting a war of attrition they could not win against the industrial powerhouse of the United States. The American strategy of island hopping was proving relentlessly effective. The United States was now on the offensive, moving steadily closer to Japan. American forces, led by admirals like Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance, had been capturing key islands across the Central Pacific. Each island taken was another step on the ladder to Tokyo. This strategy allowed them to bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and instead seize islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases for the next leap forward. American industry was in full swing, producing ships, planes, and weapons at a breathtaking rate. New aircraft carriers, superior fighter planes like the F-6F Hellcat, and a steady stream of well-trained pilots were pouring into the Pacific theater. For Japan, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Their industrial capacity was no match for America's. They were losing ships and planes faster than they could replace them. Crucially, they were also running out of trained pilots. The veteran aviators who had dominated the skies early in the war were mostly gone, lost at Midway, Guadalcanal, and in the skies over Rabaul. The new pilots being sent into combat had far less training and experience than their American counterparts. Japan was also suffering from a critical shortage of fuel, as American submarines were sinking the tankers that brought vital oil from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands. The war had become a race against time. The American military machine was grinding forward, unstoppable and growing stronger every day. The Japanese leadership knew that they had to force a decisive battle, a single great naval showdown where they could inflict such a massive defeat on the U.S. Navy that it would force the Americans to the negotiating table. They gathered what remained of their powerful fleet, hoarding their precious fuel and aircraft for one last great effort. They believed that if they could lure the American carriers into a trap, they could use their superior aircraft range to strike a knockout blow. The fate of their empire rested on this one final gamble. The American plan for the summer of 1944 was codenamed Operation Forager. Its objective was the capture of the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were not just another link in the island-hopping chain, they were the key to unlocking the final phase of the war. Located about 1,500 miles from Tokyo, the Marianas were close enough for the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers to conduct sustained bombing raids directly against the Japanese mainland. This would allow the United States to strike at Japan's industries, cities, and military infrastructure, crippling its ability to continue the fight. The capture of the Marianas was therefore a top priority for the American High Command. For Japan, the Marianas were a critical part of their inner defensive line. They had held the islands since World War I and had fortified them heavily. Losing them would be a catastrophic blow, both strategically and psychologically. It would mean that the American enemy was no longer at the outer gates of the empire, but had breached the inner sanctum. The loss of the Marianas would place the homeland itself under direct and constant threat from the air. The Japanese military leadership, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, made it clear that these islands had to be held at all costs. An American invasion of the Marianas could not be allowed to succeed. This is why the Japanese developed their own plan, Operation Ago. It was a bold and complex naval strategy designed to intercept and annihilate the American fleet supporting the invasion. The Japanese Combined Fleet, under the command of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, would sail from its bases to confront the Americans in the Philippine Sea. Ozawa believed he had a key advantage. His aircraft had a longer range than the American planes. His strategy was to locate the American carriers first, launch his planes from a safe distance, strike the American ships, and then land on airfields in the Marianas to refuel and rearm for a second attack. It was a plan that relied on perfect timing and coordination. The strategic importance of the Marianas made a massive naval confrontation inevitable. The Americans knew that their invasion fleet would be the bait that would draw the Japanese Navy into the fight they had been seeking. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, was an enormous force, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. It included not only the amphibious forces needed to invade the islands but also Task Force 58, a fast carrier group with 15 aircraft carriers, which was tasked with protecting the invasion and destroying the Japanese fleet. The stage was set for a titanic clash of naval power that would determine control of the skies and seas of the Western Pacific. When the two fleets finally steamed towards their confrontation, the differences between them were stark. The American Fifth Fleet was a testament to the nation's immense industrial power. At its heart was Task Force 58, commanded by the aggressive Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. This force alone contained 15 aircraft carriers, including 7 large fleet carriers and 8 smaller light carriers. On their decks sat nearly 900 aircraft, mostly the formidable F-6F Hellcat fighter, the SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, and the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. The American fleet was also protected by a powerful screen of new battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all equipped with advanced anti-aircraft guns. The American advantages went far beyond mere numbers. Their pilots were the product of a superior training program. They had logged hundreds of hours in the air before ever seeing combat, making them skilled, confident, and proficient in their machines. American technology was also superior. Their ships were equipped with advanced radar systems, which could detect incoming enemy aircraft from great distances, giving them precious time to prepare a defense. Furthermore, American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes, providing Admiral Spruance with a good idea of the enemy's strength and general intentions. This combination of numbers, training, and technology made the American fleet a truly formidable fighting force. On the other side, the Japanese Mobile Fleet, under Admiral Ozawa, was a powerful force but one plagued by critical weaknesses. Ozawa commanded 9 aircraft carriers, a mix of large fleet carriers, converted carriers, and light carriers. These ships carried about 450 aircraft, roughly half the number of the American fleet. While some of their planes, like the Zero fighter, were still agile, they were outmatched by the faster, more rugged, and more heavily armed American Hellcats. The Japanese fleet was also desperately short on fuel, which limited its speed and maneuverability. This shortage was a constant source of anxiety for the Japanese commanders. The most significant Japanese weakness, however, was in its pilots. The highly experienced naval aviators who had started the war were nearly all gone. The new pilots who replaced them were rushed through a truncated training program. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time and lacked the skills to survive in the face of well-trained American opponents. They were also unfamiliar with flying over the open ocean and coordinating large-scale attacks. Admiral Ozawa knew his pilots were at a disadvantage. He hoped his plan to use the land bases on Guam and Tinian and the superior range of his aircraft could overcome this critical deficiency. His fleet was a fragile sword, sharp but brittle. The battle began on the morning of June 19, 1944. True to his plan, Admiral Ozawa launched his aircraft in 4 massive waves, sending over 300 planes to attack the American fleet. He had located the Americans first, just as he had hoped. But American radar saw them coming from over 150 miles away. On the decks of the American carriers, the call went out. "Hey Rube!" It was the signal to launch all fighters. Hundreds of F-6F Hellcats roared into the sky, climbing to meet the approaching enemy. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The American pilots, guided by their shipboard fighter directors using radar, formed a protective screen in front of their fleet. The inexperienced Japanese pilots flew into this wall of fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The results were devastating. The Hellcats were superior aircraft and their pilots were far better trained. They tore into the Japanese formations, shooting down plane after plane. The Japanese attacks were poorly coordinated, and their formations fell apart under the relentless American assault. In one of the early waves, of 69 Japanese planes that were launched, 42 were shot down before they ever saw an American ship. The few that broke through the fighter screen were met by a storm of anti-aircraft fire from the battleships and cruisers of the fleet. The sky was filled with smoke, tracer fire, and falling aircraft. This one-sided aerial combat became famously known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft and a huge number of their remaining pilots. The Americans, by contrast, had lost only about 30 planes in air combat. The Japanese plan to use the airfields on Guam was also a disaster. American fighters had already swept over the island, destroying the planes on the ground. Any Japanese planes that tried to land there were ambushed and shot down. While this air battle raged, American submarines were also at work. The submarine USS Albacore torpedoed and sank Ozawa's flagship, the carrier Taiho. A few hours later, the submarine USS Kavala sank the veteran carrier Shokaku. The first day of the battle was an unmitigated catastrophe for Japan. 2 of their largest carriers were at the bottom of the sea, and their naval air power had been virtually wiped out. Admiral Ozawa was forced to transfer his flag to another ship and assess the ruin of his fleet. Admiral Spruance, meanwhile, was criticized by some for being too cautious, for not turning west to chase and destroy the rest of the Japanese fleet immediately. But his primary mission was to protect the invasion of Saipan, and he had accomplished that perfectly. He had broken the back of the Japanese attack without risking his own carriers. The sun set on June 19th over a scene of total American victory in the air. The staggering Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not the result of a single mistake, but a combination of deep-seated problems that had been building for years. The most fundamental reason for the loss was the vast difference in pilot training and experience. The American naval aviators who fought in the battle were the products of a robust and lengthy training pipeline. They had mastered their aircraft and practiced tactics extensively before being sent into combat. In contrast, the Japanese Naval Air Corps had been hollowed out. The skilled veterans of 1941 and 1942 were gone, and their replacements were simply not ready for a major fleet action against a first-rate opponent. Technology played an equally crucial role in the American victory. The United States Navy had fully integrated radar into its defensive systems. This technology acted as the fleet's eyes and ears, detecting enemy raids long before they were visible, and allowing for an organized and overwhelming response. The proximity fuse, a tiny radar in the nose of an anti-aircraft shell that caused it to explode when it got near an aircraft, made the fleet's defensive fire incredibly lethal. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their reliance on visual scouting and their lack of effective radar meant they were fighting blind against an enemy that could see for miles in every direction. The superiority of American equipment was another decisive factor. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the perfect tool for the job. It was fast, durable, well-armed, and easy to fly. It was designed specifically to defeat the Japanese Zero, and it did so with brutal efficiency. The Japanese Zero, once the master of the skies, was now obsolete. It was lightly armored and lacked the speed and climbing power of the Hellcat. In addition to their aircraft, the American carriers themselves were more robust and had better damage control procedures than their Japanese counterparts. The loss of the carriers Taiho and Shokaku, one to a single torpedo, highlighted flaws in Japanese carrier design and damage control. Finally, the American command structure and coordination were far more effective. Admiral Spruance's decision-making, while cautious, was sound. He correctly prioritized the defense of the invasion force. Vice Admiral Mitscher's handling of Task Force 58 was masterful, effectively using his radar and fighter direction officers to orchestrate the air battle. The Japanese plan, Operation Ego, was overly complex and relied on perfect execution by inexperienced forces. The coordination between Ozawa's carrier planes and the land-based aircraft in the Marianas completely failed. In the end, Japan's plan was a fragile house of cards, and the American fleet simply blew it over. It was a victory born of industrial strength, superior training, and technological dominance. The aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was swift and devastating for Japan. On June 20th, the day after the Turkey shoot, Admiral Spruance finally located the retreating Japanese fleet and launched a long-range airstrike late in the afternoon. American planes sank another carrier, the Hio, and damaged several other ships. The cost was high, as many American planes ran out of fuel returning to their carriers in the dark. But Admiral Mitscher made the daring decision to turn on his fleet's lights to guide them home, saving many pilots. When the battle was over, Japan had lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 600 aircraft, nearly its entire carrier air force. It was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. With the Japanese fleet shattered and in retreat, the American invasion of the Marianas could proceed without fear of naval interference. U.S. Marines and soldiers fought bloody battles on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, but the outcome was never in doubt. By August, the islands were secure. The strategic consequences were immediate. The Americans quickly began constructing massive air bases on the islands. Within months, fleets of B-29 Superfortress bombers began their relentless bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The war had been brought directly to Japan's doorstep, just as American planners had intended. The fall of Saipan also led directly to the collapse of the government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a clear sign of the crisis gripping Japan. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the battle was the end of its life as an effective fighting force. It still had ships, including the world's largest battleships, the Yamato and Musashi. But it no longer had a credible carrier air arm. Without planes to protect them from the air, these surface ships were vulnerable. For the remainder of the war, the Japanese Navy was forced to resort to desperate measures, including the suicidal kamikaze attacks that would begin in late 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the transition from conventional naval warfare to a final, more desperate phase of the conflict for Japan. It had lost its shield and its sword in a single battle. In the grand sweep of history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of the most decisive naval battles ever fought. It was the largest aircraft carrier battle in history, and it sealed the fate of the Pacific War. It was not as dramatic as the turning point at Midway, but it was the battle that broke the back of the Japanese Navy for good. It cleared the way for the final American advances, leading to the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The victory was a demonstration of America's overwhelming industrial and technological power, and it ensured that the path to the ultimate defeat of Japan was now clear and irreversible. The silent depths of the Philippine Sea hold the wrecks of Japanese ships and planes, monuments to a battle that changed the world.